I'd like to welcome everybody here today. My name is Gordon Hull. I'm the director of the Ethics Center here at UNC Charlotte, and I am very pleased to introduce Karen Levy, who will be the last speaker in our series on biased AI. If you missed earlier talks in the series, Serena Wang, Alex Hanna, and so forth, Ben Green, then they're archived on the center's YouTube channel. And the best way to get to there is to go to the webpage, which is ethics.uncc.edu or ethics.Charlotte.edu because we're rebranding. And then there's a little YouTube icon on the upper right-hand corner. This talk will also appear there. So Karen Levy is in the Department of Information Science at Cornell University. She also has an association of some sort with the law school. I'm not sure quite how that's described, but she does all sorts of good work on employment and AI and employment and automation. And today she's going to be talking about a topic I first heard her talk about a few years ago. This is actually pre-COVID. There was this panel discussion at the Privacy Law Conference, and she was introducing this topic about how automation affects the trucking industry. And it was absolutely fascinating because she was saying things like, well, I've been reading all the trucker magazines for the last year or two. I was like, okay, I'm going to follow this project, right? So she's going to be speaking to this and what automation has done to trucking. Apparently, it's created a new cyborg form called the Robotrucker. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Karen.
Well, thanks all for having me. It's nice to join you even virtually. And the other folks you mentioned who are part of this series are a tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. I'm not sure how you normally do this or if you have a preference, Gordon, but I'm happy to kind of make this a little bit conversational. And if people have questions, we can just take them as they come.
Yeah, that suits me.
Object.
Suits me. Folks, there's a small, particularly since there's like 20, 25 people here, that's small enough that we can.
Okay. That works well for me. So feel free to chime in or use, I have the chat open so I can look there and I can look for raised hands if folks want to ask stuff as we go or raise points that I'm eliding. So as Gordon said, I've been working on trucking for a very long time now. It was my doctoral dissertation in sociology. I started the project initially in 2011, which is hard to believe because never did I realize that my dissertation topic would become like a solid quarter of my life I would spend working on this, but it's been a really enjoyable experience and I have learned a lot in doing it. So I'm excited to share it with you. I'm in the process, I just submitted copy edits on my book about this topic, which is called Data Driven. Get it? So that should be out later this year, I'm told. Sort of ironically, the book is delayed because of supply chain issues, which is sort of a poetic ending to, based on what I'm going to talk about. But makes sense. I guess it works out nicely that way. But it should be out later this year. So what I thought I would talk with you about today is I thought I would first give you just kind of like a brief overview of trucking as a sector and some of the research I've been doing. I'm curious, actually, and I don't know how well I can ask you this question via Zoom, but I'm always interested in whether anybody in a talk that I give has some connection to the trucking industry. Oftentimes, there's not a huge overlap in the Venn diagram between academics and truckers, but every once in a while, somebody's like, "Oh yeah, my uncle was a trucker, my cousin was a trucker." So if you have a personal connection, I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to chime in and let me know that. But yeah, so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about kind of the broad strokes of the project, and then I'm going to talk about the final. Ian's grandfather was a long haul trucker. All right, good. So you've got a connection. And then I'll talk about this final chapter of the book, which is called Robotruckers, which is I'll explain kind of how that has come about. All right, good. I'm glad to see some trucking allegiances here. Okay, so let me advance my slides here. For those of you who don't have this personal connection or grandfather or uncle who's in trucking, let me just give you a very brief overview, too short overview of the industry, which has sort of surprisingly been getting a little bit more attention recently. There was a big Times article, Times editorial about trucking a couple weeks ago. The Biden administration announced something called the Trucking Action Plan, which is designed to address some of the problems in the industry. But for the most part, and during the broader course of my research on the industry, it has gone sort of unnoticed or under commented upon by policymakers and kind of by the public. which is ironic because truckers are, if you think about them, oh yeah, Lisa, I'm getting there. I'm going to talk about the turnover rate in just a moment, actually. Truckers are in some sense human infrastructure, right? They are unbelievably essential, right? Completely essential to the way the economy functions. If you look around the room where you are right now, almost everything in that room, almost without exception, was probably at some point on a truck being driven down the highway by a human truck driver. Almost without exception, it's something like 90+% of goods at some point. I'm talking here about long haul trucking. So long haul truckers are the folks who drive long distances. It's more than 150 air miles is the legal designation from a hub. So not your FedEx driver or your UPS driver. There are interesting issues that attend that kind of work too, but I'm thinking really about the folks who are driving like very long distances and are away from home, overnight period, sometimes for days or weeks at a time. Truckers have this saying, which is, if you got it, a truck brought it, which sort of underscores this point that I'm making about just how essential they are to the economy. And, like much infrastructure, we tend to kind of only notice truckers when, like in a negative way, right? When there's a problem, when there's a breakdown, when there's a supply chain squeeze, as we've had recently, or sometimes even, if we're just trying to pass them on the highway and we don't like having to do that because it's a little scary, or maybe we're intimidated by them at a truck stop, but it's usually negative if we think about them at all. The political economy of trucking has an interesting history, which I will only gloss over to the extent it's important to understand the rest of the story. So trucking is a deregulated industry. It has been since 1980. Before that point, the federal government had a really active role in determining rates in trucking. So they would set standard freight rates and in determining who could enter, like what new entrants there could be into the market. So you had to get like a license essentially from the government to operate a trucking company, which gave them some command over kind of the structure of the industry. That went away in 1980. It was one of several industries that was deregulated at that time. And as a result, the industry is highly competitive. Companies operate on extraordinarily thin margins. There's kind of a race to the bottom in terms of, always looking to cut a few pennies here and there. There's a lot of kind of new entrants coming into the market always, and then new companies leaving the market always. One kind of corollary is this, as Lisa alluded to in the chat, is the rate of driver turnover. Trucking companies will tell you that there's a driver shortage in this country. There are many, many, many thousands of trucking jobs that are unfilled. Drivers will be quick to correct you if you say this and say it's not a driver shortage, it's a wage shortage. There are plenty of people who have commercial driver's licenses, but they don't stay in trucking jobs. The turnover rate in trucking for large carriers is about 100% a year, which is to say that on average, every trucker for a large company, like not for a mom and pop, will leave their job every year. They have to rehire every year. Basically, it's an industry, and it's not much. It's, I think, roughly 70% for smaller carriers, so it's high for them too. But basically, it's a job that kind of churns people through and spits them out at the end, for reasons that I'll talk about in a minute. Largely, though, the short version of the story is that it's just a really bad job, right? Like, it is a job that is incredibly difficult. It has, I think, I have to check the numbers, but I think it's the sixth or seventh highest rate of occupational fatalities in the United States. Truckers have incredibly high rates of health problems related to being on the road all the time, like sleep apnea and obesity and asthma, all kinds of health issues. They're away from home, obviously. And as we'll see, the work is roughly equivalent to sweatshop labor in terms of the risk that they incur, the hours that they work, and the low pay that they receive. I'll just say quick, I don't know why I'm previewing this as though I'm going to come back to it later. I'll just tell you now. The contemporary trucker makes roughly $47,000 a year. Back in 1980, before deregulation, they made the equivalent of $110,000 in today's dollars. So it's just an absolutely catastrophic wage reduction. The number of about 47K a year has been stagnant for about 15 years. So it hasn't moved, even despite this, alleged shortage, as you might expect it to, right? We might think that the way supply and demand work would drive these wages up, but instead the kind of response from the industry has just been to kind of churn in new meat rather than raise the wages to something that would encourage folks to stay. Despite all this, despite kind of objectively, like many of these measures that make it a bad job, trucking culture is quite proud. If you talk to truckers about why they got into the industry, many of them will talk to you about kind of the romance of the thing, right? Like what it's like to kind of drive across the highway, to see a lot of the country. A lot of these folks, the other job options on the table either didn't exist if they're from rural communities, or, involved a lot of oversight. I can't tell you how many truckers have told me that they just wanted to do their work without someone looking over their shoulder. Like that's been really, that sense of autonomy, right? Not in the sense of machine autonomy, but in the sense of human autonomy and control over one's work has been really crucial for folks. That is also very tightly tied up, and I'm not going to go deep into this today, but with a notion of masculinity. So I have one article in which I kind of delve into this in more detail. The trucking industry is about 95% male at present. That's actually lower than it's been in the past. It's been closer to 100% for a long time. But it's not only mostly male, but it is like very masculine, right? So there's like a very tight connection sort of between the notion of control over the vehicle and economic provision and physical stamina that kind of tie in together with masculinity. So you'll notice that when I talk about truckers, I'll often kind of default to male pronouns, and that's kind of a reflection of this masculinity that's inherent in the job. Just to kind of give you like a bit of an impressionistic sense of this, these are obviously not like your prototypical truckers, but this is some sort of cultural iconography of the trucker. These are from kind of the heyday of trucker culture in the 1970s. These are both movies made about trucking. Again, we're not going to do a deep dive into this, but you can see just even from these posters, right, that there's this kind of notion of cowboyism, a disrespect for authority. I don't know if you can see there's like a sheriff being kind of chased off the road by Peter Fonda on the right. These are not folks who have a lot of political and economic power, but the truck kind of takes the place of that, or instantiates in some sense, the notion of power, and becomes kind of an extension of their masculinity. Now, the dark side of this, or one of the dark sides of it, is that trucking is extremely fatiguing. It's just incredibly tiring work. And truckers this has been known for a long time, and truckers have for a very long time turned to chemicals and other strategies to stay awake, some of which are legal and some of which are not. And that's in part kind of what we demand of them, right? For things to move at the pace at which we expect them to move, for us to get our deliveries from Amazon in not very much time, just for grocery shelves to get stocked in the way that we want them to, that is what's demanded of them. This is exacerbated by the fact that the dominant pay structure in trucking is that truckers are paid by the mile. So they're only paid for the time that they are driving, moving actively down the highway. They are not paid for the time that they are stuck in traffic. They're not paid for the time that they're doing inspections. They're not paid for the time that they're resting. They're not paid for the time that they're loading or unloading at a customer's dock. All of that is, for almost all drivers, unpaid. So they have this other saying, which is, if the wheel ain't turning, you ain't earning, right? Like they want to be moving all the time. So they are incentivized to stay on the road even when they're tired. I put this picture of Tracy Morgan up here only because the Tracy Morgan crash in 2014, there was a truck, if you remember, that I was a Walmart driver who hit Tracy Morgan's tour bus and killed one of Tracy Morgan's, somebody else who was on Tracy Morgan's tour. That was like one kind of brief moment in the public eye for this problem of trucker fatigue. But generally, this is like kind of a known problem within the industry, but not one that commands a lot of public attention. In that case, the driver had been awake for 28 hours, the subsequent investigation showed, which is not typical. Like that's pretty extreme, but it's not so atypical, right? Like it's kind of one instance of a fairly common problem. Now, officially, of course, it's illegal for a trucker to drive for 28 hours straight. There are federal regulations that have been in place since the 1930s that cap the number of hours that truckers can drive. But the enforcement of these rules has been based on like pieces of paper logbooks, which I've shown you on this slide here. Basically, the way this works is that there's a certain number of hours you can drive a maximum per day and per week. Basically, what you do is you just like write down on the log that you wrote that you drove that number of hours. These are just regulatory documents, so these are not connected to the actual pay that truckers receive. They just need to like have them up to date and to submit them to the government periodically, or to have them ready to show at roadside if they get pulled over or if they go through a weigh station. So because they don't actually connect to driver's pay, but are just these kind of regulatory documents, they're not like a super strong form of enforcement. And basically everybody lies on these forms. Like it's a kind of well-known open secret. Truckers will call these their swindle sheets or their coloring books or their comic books. There've been some surveys that show that, like 90% of truckers will kind of say like, we know that these forms are not really a valid reflection of how much we're driving. And it's fairly easy to figure out kind of how to cheat, right? Like if you spent 10 minutes looking at this, you could figure out that you just drive what you need to do. And then like after the fact, you sort of fill it in a way that is legally defensible. So the kind of response to this from the federal government, if you think this is a problem and that people should be following the law, is a turn towards digital surveillance. And so this is what is in the image here is something called an electronic logging device, or ELD. And the ELD is kind of the primary focus of this book that I wrote and my own study of the trucking industry. The ELD is now, as of 2017, late 2017, mandatory for all truckers to buy, install, and use. And it's basically like a hardwired form of logging, right? So it's connected to the truck's engine and it automatically detects when the truck is moving and where it's going. And the thinking is that this just makes it much more difficult. It's like sort of a tamper-proof version of the log, right? It makes it much more difficult for truckers to lie about how long they've been on the road. It's not actually impossible for them to lie about this. And I have a chapter of the book where I talk about ways that they still find their way around this technology. But this is what's sort of being imposed to kind of account for that slippage between the law and social practice. Now, based on what you know about truckers now, you could sort of imagine how well these are going over. These are just a few, you don't have to actually read these word for word, but these are a few examples just from my research of talking to truckers about the kind of their views of the electronic logging device. The kind of broad strokes of it is that they find them offensive. They feel like they, treat them like criminals or like children. They feel quite put upon, that they're, putting their lives at risk, and that they're being supervised in this way that is often quite privacy invasive. A lot of that concern is driven actually, in fact, not so much by the electronic logging itself, but by the sort of auxiliary technologies that are built into these devices. So what I'm showing on this slide here is a chart from like an electronic logging device, like a vendor brochure, right? Comparing, and I don't know how well you can see this, but they're comparing like different models and showing like what the different capabilities are. And the reason I'm showing you this is only to demonstrate that this thing I have an arrow next to that says hours of service, that's the capability I've just told you about. But all of these other capabilities are very commonly built into logging devices, but are not part of this kind of regulatory infrastructure. Instead, these auxiliary capabilities include a lot of things that are very popular with truckers' managers to give them better insight into the things that their employees are doing. So these often will include things like, detecting real-time speed, detecting braking activity, how hard a trucker is braking, fuel economy, right? How much fuel they're using is like a big cost driver in the industry, knowing if they're changing lanes without signaling, knowing if they're going out of route, all kinds of just like oftentimes camera systems that are trained on the driver, which I'll talk more about in a minute, like very, very, very granular performance data that really changes what it means to be a trucker. And of course, this is not mandated by the government, but by virtue of the fact that they've all had to install this device for regulatory purposes, that also kind of opens the door to a bunch more surveillance by companies, right? That affects what it is to be a trucker. In one paper that I'm not going to talk about today, but if we had more time, we could go into this. I kind of do a deep dive on how this changes the managerial dynamics over truckers, tracing kind of like what types of knowledge dispatchers and fleet managers now have at their disposal that they didn't have before, and how this kind of changes what kind of knowledge is useful in trucking, and what resources truckers have available to them. I'm going to skip that, but just to give you a sense for like what the broader kind of body of work is trying to do. The other bit of it that I did want to call out today for what I'm going to talk about in a moment, is that in the course of kind of studying the development of these devices and of the law, I looked at a bunch of regulatory comments at the National Archives, looking at kind of, because this mandate was about 20 years in development. So there were lots of different iterations of the mandate that were proposed. And so there's thousands of documents you can read about different truckers and other parties' views of this technology. And there was this one comment that really stuck out to me, that a trucker said, I think in 2013. He said, "A computer does not know when we are tired, fatigued, or anything else. Any piece of electronics that's not directly hooked up to my body cannot tell me this." Now, my sense from reading this comment is not that what the trucker was proposing is that, what the government should do is like hook these electronics directly up to my body in order to know me better. Like that was not the alternative future that this person was envisioning. But it ends up being sort of accidentally prescient for reasons that we will get into as I talk about some of the way that the technology has subsequently developed. So I thought what I would talk to you about today. So to be totally honest with you, right, I started this study in 2011. This technology finally became mandatory in 2017. I was like studying its development and deployment. And after a while, I would tell people I studied trucking and technology, and they would say like, oh yeah, autonomous trucks. And I'd say like, no, like not that, this other thing that you've never heard of that human truckers are going to have to use, like the surveillance technology. And people, I think sometimes were almost disappointed when I said that, because they kind of wanted me to be studying autonomous trucks. And I started to ask myself, like, should I be studying autonomous trucks? Like, or more, to be completely candid about it, I got a little anxious that maybe autonomous trucks were going to come around, and like all of the study that I had done of this technology was like almost moot, right? Because it would no longer be needed, because there would be no more human truck drivers anyway. That's obviously not the case for reasons that I'll explain, but because of that kind of concern, I thought, okay, well, when I read this book, I want to include some discussion of autonomous vehicles and what connection, if any, they have to the electronic logging device, right, to the surveillance technology. And so that's what I thought I would spend some time today talking with you about. Now, part of the reason, of course, that people ask me this question about, like, wait, aren't we getting autonomous trucks and there won't be truckers anymore, is that the media has really run away with that narrative over the last several years. This is part of kind of a broader, I don't want to say panic, but it's almost been a panic over the last few years about kind of automation and AI and robotics, and like whether the robots were coming for our jobs. And this question of like what, I'm going to go fast over this, but we can go into it more in the Q&A if folks are interested. This question of kind of what jobs are likely to be automated is a question that comes up periodically in economic forecasting, especially when some kind of wave of new technologies, creates this potential for what's sometimes called skill bias technological change, right? The idea that certain forms of technology will change the landscape of what jobs are required and tends to disproportionately negatively impact low-wage work, right? Work that's kind of at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. Historically, the kind of primary axis of distinction for what jobs were sort of considered to be in danger by a new technology, historically, the kind of primary thing folks would look at was whether the job was manual or cognitive, right? Physical work was easier to automate, whereas cognitive work, like knowledge work, was harder to automate. This is a paper from 2003 by some economists, including Frank Levy, who's no relation to me, that kind of laid this out. And actually, in that paper, one of the kind of predictions that those economists make, they're saying like, well, what actually matters in 2003, their prediction is both kind of the manual versus cognitive nature of the work, as well as the routinization of the work. So is the work something that requires kind of doing the same thing, undergoing the same protocol or rule set over and over again, or is it something that requires like applying knowledge to new situations? And they actually said, truck driving is likely to be safe, according to their 2003 predictions, because trucking is a manual task, but it consists of largely non-routine situations, right? Like a trucker is constantly encountering new environments, having to make new decisions based on new data. And in 2003, they didn't think that that was the sort of thing that could be automated away. Of course, fast forwarding a little bit, in 2013, 10 years later, people start to become much more aware of AI, right? AI has developed, there've been huge technical strides in things like computer vision and speech recognition and, reinforcement learning and other systems that kind of learn from their environment constantly. And this kind of does away with this routine versus non-routine distinction, or at least that's the prediction that some folks make. So there's this very influential paper by an economist and a machine learning researcher in 2013, this Brian Osborne paper, which makes a new set of predictions, giving the kind of computational capabilities that are emerging in AI at the time. This was like a super people can, and I take issue with some of the methodologies in this paper as well, but it had a huge impact on policy. So it has, thousands of citations. The White House took it up in some reporting that they did on kind of the future of work. And what Brian Osborne predicted is that about 47% of US jobs were at significant risk, according to automation, within the next, I think it was decade. And according to them, trucking was kind of one of the industries in the crosshairs, right? So they predict that trucking jobs this is like ridiculously precise, would have a 78.6% likelihood of being automated away in the next several years. The White House in 2016 predicted that 80 to 100% of heavy truck driving related jobs would be threatened or substantially altered by autonomous vehicles over the coming years. So this, of course, like raises the hackles of a lot of folks in trucking, right? Like it's already this difficult job. People start talking about this idea of the robot apocalypse coming and taking away this roughly 2 million jobs that long haul truckers are engaged in. And part of the source of this concern is the fact that trucking, 2 million people is a lot of people. Trucking is also the most common job in 29 states. This is data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2014. So like, obviously, I mean, it goes without saying that sort of a massive disruption to this large distributed labor force, including a labor force that's distributed in a lot of places where there just aren't as many, or at this time where there weren't as many job options, right, where manufacturing had sort of dried up, raises a lot of concerns about what's going to happen to those people. And it may be that this is an industry that's like ripe for disruption anyway, right? It's very difficult, unsafe work, as I mentioned. There are these labor shortage issues. Fatigue is a real issue, right? Like maybe those are the problems that we could alleviate through automation. So as a result, there's massive investment in autonomous vehicle technology, especially as to autonomous trucks. I won't go into a bunch of depth about this, but basically investment just like skyrockets around 2018. It's come down some since then, but it's higher than it was before. A couple of self-driving car startups start running these demos. One of the more kind of splashy ones was this one by Otto. That was a beer delivery from, I want to say it was Golden, Colorado to somewhere maybe in Texas or New Mexico, I can't remember, where they delivered 25,000 cans of Budweiser. It was very all-American, right? Like very splashy. They videotaped it. It was on TV. Of course, what they don't show you on TV is that like this truck was self-driving, but it also had a safety driver and was accompanied by a convoy of four state patrollers, 3 company vehicles, and 2 tow trucks. So like obviously out of scope for your everyday beer delivery, but does the job, right, of kind of showing like the promise or, you know, perceived promise of this technology for the future. So one kind of important thing to notice in this narrative, right, that I've been explaining to you about the autonomous vehicle and the role it might play in the industry is that it sort of contemplates the trucker as this displaced body, right, both physically, right, the trucker is maybe no longer in the cab in this vision, and economically, right, so he's removed from the cab and he's removed from his means of economic provision because he is imperfect, he's irrelevant, his body is not good enough to do this work. And as a result, like maybe we have this sector-wide unemployment that's quite problematic, not only for these drivers, but for the country as a whole. This is the story. My own kind of predictions, right, and I think that folks are kind of coming around to this view more generally, is like a little bit less alarmist, right? It's not, I don't think it's the case that we should expect to see sort of massive sector-wide unemployment in trucking. The reality is much more complicated, right? Unemployment is a real threat, and I don't want to minimize it, but I don't think we're going to see this kind of massive decimation of the profession in like a sudden phase transition. And that's because the path to autonomy in trucking is likely to be more of a slope than a cliff, right? It's not going to be human, robot all of a sudden. Instead, we're going to have this integration period where we see human and machine labor kind of having to integrate into one another. And there's a bunch of reasons for this. One of the reasons is that kind of all work, this is from Michael Polanyi, who wrote about the tacit dimension of work, right? Like all work requires, is a kind of more art than science, right? Like it's, this is, I know that you maybe can't read this, but he says, among other things, that the skill of the driver cannot be replaced by thorough schooling in the history of the motor car. What he means there, right, is that all work, but here he explicitly is calling out driving, right? Like you can write down the rule set, but like there's always something else, right? There's always some other dimension to work tasks that can't be easily accounted for. And I think, you know, that's not to say that like we never automate jobs, but it does suggest that that process is likely to be slower and bumpier than we might otherwise think. And this is certainly the case in trucking, right? Truckers do all kinds of stuff besides driving a truck. They keep their freight safe, right? They secure stuff to a flatbed. They load and unload stuff. They're required to do 2 safety inspections a day. They change flat tires. They interface with customers. Like they do all kinds of things. And it's not to say that we couldn't figure out some alternative way of getting these things done or automate some of them, but we are nowhere close to being able to automate all of them, right? So the primary task of driving, which we also have problems automating, which I'll talk about, is one piece of what it is to be a trucker, but it is not the entirety of what it is to be a trucker. We also expect to see slower adoption because people are just afraid of self-driving trucks. There's, you know, in kind of public opinion polls about autonomous vehicles, about 70% of the public says that they would be afraid to ride in a self-driving car. That'll change, I'm sure, but it hasn't changed yet. There have been some very high-profile autonomous vehicle accidents. And if people are afraid of autonomous cars, they're probably going to be that much more afraid of autonomous trucks, which are, you know, 80 to 100,000 pounds and like barreling down the highway. There's like literal horror movies made about autonomous trucks. I don't know if anybody has seen Maximum Overdrive. It was Stephen King's 1986 movie about kind of a truck with a mind of its own and a taste for blood. But you know, that it's a horror movie for a reason, right? Like that's scary. There are real concerns about data security and hacking and all kinds of things like that. This will all change, of course, but it will change gradually, right? And that's going to slow down adoption as well. Okay, so if we kind of take as given, if you accept my premise that this is going to be a slower process rather than a phase transition, what does that kind of mean for truckers? Like, what will it mean for them to integrate their labor into autonomous vehicle technology? And so that's what I want to take the rest of the time to talk about. How much time do I have, Gordon?
You're doing fine.
Okay, you say that now. I will go fairly quickly through these, and we can always return to them if you, for some reason, really want to know the details about one of these models. But there are three kind of models of integration that I propose this kind of human-to-machine integration might take. Just to kind of spoil it for you, the first two I think are not happening, and it's the third one that I think is actually happening, but the first two are some kind of possibilities. The first of them is what we sometimes call the handoff in human-robot interaction. And the idea here is basically that you see sort of the passing of the baton between the human and the robot. Each kind of does that to which they're best suited. The robot typically is doing the more routine tasks, and the human steps in when the situation like exceeds the robot's capability. It doesn't look anything like this, but this is like a little piece of clip art that comes up when you Google the handoff, and I just find it funny, so I like to put it in the slide because this is not it. But it is the kind of thing that we do see successfully occur in some sectors. So like robotic surgery is a good example, right? Where like the human surgeon is still very skilled and is important to do a lot of that job, but there are pieces of it that might be more effectively accomplished by like a robotic arm or some other system. And this is not really far-fetched for trucking. I know you can't read this, and that's fine. This is just to demonstrate that this thing exists. So this is the Society of Automotive Engineers has these levels of autonomy that they detail, which you don't need to know what they are. It's just to know that there are these levels of autonomy. Basically, they kind of delineate 6 different degrees to which a vehicle can be automated. And at the low end, there are things that we all kind of have in our cars already, kind of driver assist systems, anti-lock brakes, lane assistance, parking assistance, things like this. These might seem far from autonomous vehicles, but like these are on the spectrum of autonomy. And we all often use them and maybe don't even think about them as autonomous systems today. The current state of the art is roughly at what is sometimes called level 2 or level 3 autonomy. So this is like Tesla's autopilot, if you're familiar with that, where the car is doing a lot of the driving, but the human being, really importantly, is expected to be monitoring the driving environment because the human is expected to step in if the capabilities of the vehicle are exceeded. So because of that, like Tesla, they don't enforce this particularly well, but the Tesla vehicle requires the human to stay alert, or it's supposed to require the human to stay alert for that reason. So the machine basically has the baton most of the time, but the human has to be kind of ready to grab the baton at any moment. Okay, so the vision of this in trucking is that what would happen while the machine has the baton is that there's kind of this freedom that's achieved for the human trucker, right? The human trucker would still be in the vehicle. It's not exactly clear whether they'd be getting paid for that time. Like we haven't quite ironed that out yet. But the thinking is that they could engage in these other things, right? They could be, as the American Trucking Association puts it, unshackled from the wheel in order to do other work like order processing or inventory management. Or as a product manager at Auto put it, they could learn a second trade or nap and relax, right? That this could be kind of leisure time almost for the worker. Of course, in practice, what we know is that this is not a feasible, that's not going to happen. That's not really a feasible way to divide up baton passing in driving. There's this really wonderful paper called Ironies of Automation. It's a 1983 paper by this IO psychologist named Lisanne Bainbridge, in which she identifies this really kind of crucial problem, which is that if you take kind of the easy part, Gordon, this is exactly it. Yes, if you take away the easy parts of the person's job, automating those away actually makes the harder parts harder, right? This is sometimes called in driving the hours of boredom and moments of terror problem, right? Like human beings are just not good at sitting there doing nothing or relaxing or taking inventory or whatever it is they're doing. And then all of a sudden hopping in when there's an emergency, like that's not cognitively feasible for us. A study by the National Highway Traffic Administration in 2015 found that it takes humans about 17 seconds to regain control of a vehicle from zero, right? Like from paying no attention to actually like being in control and being able to make safe decisions. You get nothing even close to that in the driving context, right? To avoid a safety critical situation. We're at the level of milliseconds, not 17 seconds. There are other problems too. There's skill atrophy. So the less we drive, the less good we are at driving. In some sense, the better the technology gets, the worse the human is likely to get because we just intervene less often. There's a lot of really interesting research, which I won't go into, from World War II, actually, at looking at what's called I just blanked. Vigilance decrement in robot or in radar monitors, people who would look at radars for like important blips. Basically, if you tell a person like, just sit there and do nothing, and then there's going to be an emergency, get ready for it, their vigilance decreases like notably over time. We're just not built to do that kind of work. Like, we're really bad at it, and we find it very fatiguing. So there's a bunch of reasons we might expect this model not to work well in trucking. And some people think this is really just an intractable problem for autonomous vehicles more generally. Okay, so what's the second option? The second option, which I'll go through even more quickly, is what's sometimes called network coordination. And so here the idea is that rather than kind of dividing up the focus of the driving task in this in the moment way, we might instead think about dividing up driving like over the route, right? So more close to the way that like if you and I are going on a road trip together, I don't just throw up my hands and say like, Gordon, take it away, right? That's not what I would do. Instead, we would have a decision that at some point on the route, we would pass off control of the car and one person would be fully in control while the other person is not, right? It's the same way you would like take a road trip with a friend. So the thinking here is that you're kind of dividing the driving task up over segments. There are these predictable moments of transition, right, which is nicer for, you know, avoiding the kind of vigilance decrement problem. And several trucking technology firms have kind of set their sights on this sort of model. And one reason that that might be feasible is that there are, it's difficult to fully automate the driving task, but that the things that are difficult about driving kind of occur in this lumpy way, right? So places where there's a lot of pedestrians, or kind of like this lot, like sometimes literally the last mile, right? Like from the highway exit onward, where there's more predictable environmental considerations. Those are hard for machines, but that could be the part that the human does, right? And then the highway driving, especially if it's kind of straight line, good weather highway driving, machines are pretty good at that. Autonomous vehicles are pretty capable of doing that without intervention. So it could be that they sort of take over the long haul. This was Uber's suggestion in 2018. So Uber kind of proposed a model for their autonomous vehicle division that would have sort of taken this approach. What they suggested basically was like a hub and spoke sort of model. So they would have autonomous trucks kind of bridging the distance between these hubs, right? Like, you know, out on the highway. And then they would work with human truckers who would kind of use an app. I think I have a picture of it actually. Something like this. They would have a port where human truckers would sort of take the truck for the last mile, right? They would take it from the hub to the delivery point. And Uber actually projected that this would increase the number of trucking jobs and that it would be much better for the human trucker, right? Because they could work locally. They could just do those last mile deliveries and they wouldn't be facing the same problems around fatigue and being away from home and things like that. You can see why this would have appealed to someone like Uber because it involves this kind of load matching algorithm, which is not so dissimilar from the types of things that they do in rideshare. I talked to Uber about this actually at the time, as did several other folks who kind of study the trucking industry. And I have to admit to you that when they told me they had some plan for how to deal with trucking labor, I was initially like skeptical because Uber doesn't have like a great track record for dealing with human labor. And then actually, as I like thought more about the plan and heard more about what they were considering, I kind of came around. Like I thought, okay, well, this could be like oddly good for truckers. Short hauls are good. Short hauls are desirable in trucking because it's easier on your body. The issue was, though, of course, that as I explained to you, drivers get paid by the mile. So what Uber was proposing to do was basically automate away the most profitable part of the job for humans. But the reason I had some kind of optimism about this is I thought, you know, this is an industry that's ripe for kind of an economic disruption. It would be great if we could actually move to an hourly model or some model in which truckers are actually paid for their labor. And Uber might be powerful enough to make that happen, right? If that's kind of what stands between, you know, their plan and their plan becoming reality, like maybe they can actually go cause some legal or regulatory reform in DC to get truckers paid for their time. And maybe this ends up being like a strange bedfellows situation that's good for everybody. So not only me, but other people too kind of thought like, all right, well, maybe Uber is actually, is like weirdly the secret to good labor conditions in trucking. Unfortunately, though, shortly thereafter, about 6 months after I had that conversation with them, Uber shuttered its truck group for a variety of reasons that are kind of out of scope, but which partly had to do with kind of the technical challenges of the model. There's some other companies that have proposed something similar since then, but I think this would have been a huge lift even for Uber, right? Because the amount of infrastructure required to build this nationwide network is really not something that like any startup is going to be able to do. So I don't really see any prospects for this happening anytime soon. So that brings us finally, to the final thing that is actually happening in trucking. And this is what we might think of as hybridization. So what we're actually seeing in the near term is human-robot interaction not looking like co-driving or coordinating across a route, but instead like actually the direct integration of the trucker and the machine into one another, right? So the Robotrucker. Now, this is Gordon alluded to these trucker magazines that I read, which I still read because I'm invested in them now. And I've talked to a lot of the people who work there, and they're really nice people. This is from a 2017 blog post that was published by a truckers trade magazine called Landline. And the article that accompanies this cartoon is called something about the Robotrucker, right? So that's where I got this title. Now, this is obviously a cartoon, right? But it is actually like only barely an exaggeration of things that are on the market, right? What the cartoon is obviously illustrating is kind of this proliferation of gadgets that a trucker is laden with in order to keep him awake and alert to do his job. These are tools that are often kind of marketed as fatigue detection systems, or sometimes they're called lone worker monitoring devices. And what they're designed to do is often to use AI technology to detect or infer how tired a trucker's body is and how fit he is to complete the driving task at that moment. So just to give you like a very fast tour of what some of these look like, a really common one is a camera system, an eye tracking camera system, where the camera is like focused on trained on the driver's face and looks for things like eyelid flutter or like chin nods to detect if the trucker is tired. Will detect if their gaze is on the road or not. There's lots of systems on the market like this. My favorite one actually is the system that integrates with a vibrating seat cushion so that when the trucker gets tired, it'll kind of like goose him back into alertness. But they do all kinds of things. Some of them will play alarms, some of them will flash lights in the driver's eyes. They will almost always send some record of this to the back office, to the dispatcher. Some other stuff in this vein. This is a vest that Mercedes was working on, although I don't know if they ended up deploying it or not, that monitored a trucker's heart rate, and it could stop the truck automatically if it sensed that the trucker was having a heart attack. This is something called the Smart Cap. This basically does like a constant EEG on the driver's brain waves in order to detect if he's fatigued. This is something called the Maven Machine's Copilot. Does something similar. This is it's a headset that's kind of detecting mirror checks to see if the driver's checking their mirror as much as they should be. There's several others. There's one that's like a wrist-based wearable that's being developed, I think, in Latvia, that measures heart rate and skin conductivity and will actually like deliver a small electric shock to the trucker to like goose him back up into being alert. They call it a gentle electric shock if the driver continues to be too fatigued to drive. So why did I tell you all of this? The reason is because I just want you to really notice the distance between these two narratives, right? In the first narrative, AI is being used to displace the trucker, right? To kick him out of the cab. But that's not really the felt reality of AI in trucking today. Like the felt reality is not that the trucker's not in the cab. The trucker's very much still there. It's just that they are joined by this set of systems, these cameras on their face and these wearable devices that are shocking them and flashing lights in their eyes and playing horns in their ears and doing all these things because it's recognized, right, that the trucker still needs to be there. But because, we're concerned about this fatigue, because he's part of this system, he's sort of compelled to be hybridized, right? He's compelled to sort of turn into this cyborg in this very intimate way, right? And that's not kind of the common narrative that we often see when we hear about autonomy in vehicles, right? That tends not to be the story. The story tends to be about displacement and about the quantity of work. But the suggestion I want to make here is really that, it's the quality and dignity of work that also matters. And that's much less often accounted for when you look at these economic forecasts. And then this is the last thing I'll say about it. The other kind of bit of this kind of from a conceptual point of view is that like, obviously it was naive of me to think that automation was going to substitute for surveillance, right? As I kind of initially feared when I started looking into these technologies. In fact, what it is that automation and surveillance are complements, right? Like these fatigue tracking devices are common not only in trucking, but are increasingly also common in passenger vehicles, right? Which have some partial autonomy because they have to ensure that we are alert, right? They have to ensure that we are paying attention. So these types of, technologies, the gaze tracking and things like that are becoming much more common in just maybe in your own vehicles, maybe some people in this call even have these. It's not to suggest that like that's not appropriate or that we don't want to monitor the alertness of a driver. It's just to suggest that our conversation about automation also needs to be a conversation about how much privacy we want to sacrifice for the sake of getting some help with driving. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. I feel like that went much longer than I anticipated, but it is what it is. So thank you for bearing with me.
All right, so yeah, we can have questions unless chaos happens, then just unmute yourself and have that. All right, I'll start. So it seems to me that the current behemoth or elephant in the room or whatever for both automation of workers and trucking is Amazon. So what can you say about Amazon? Because I know that like in the, legendarily in their factories, the workers are unionizing not because they want money, but because they want some relief from the robots.
Yeah.
And of course, Amazon has a lot of trucks on the road now too.
Yeah, definitely. I guess maybe I have two things to say about that. One is that, to some extent, I think it's important to recognize the degree to which we all participate in this system and support it. So like I buy stuff on Amazon all the time. Like I probably have 4 pending orders now. I'm constantly checking to see where those things are, right? Like it's that customer demand and the idea that I should have this thing the next day that is contributing here. So this is not to suggest that it's my fault or your fault or really to assign blame at all, but it's just to recognize that, kind of the consumer culture that relies on Amazon is part of one of the drivers of fatigue in the industry. The other thing I would say more generally maybe about unionization, because that is obviously has been in the news with respect to Amazon in the last week or so, is that interestingly, I actually don't think there's a lot of promise for unionization for long haul drivers. So the rate of unionization in long haul trucking is in the single digits. Nobody has like great numbers on it, but everybody kind of agrees it's very low. There are different reasons for that, but in my own kind of discussions with truckers, there seems to be just sort of a generalized distrust of being told what to do, which sometimes kind of relates to unions just as it might to a company. The Teamsters were originally a trucking union, right? Like there was a much higher rate of unionization in trucking in like the 70s, which has diminished quite significantly over time. And, because it's a mobile profession and you don't like have coworkers in the same sense that you would, in a place where everybody's going, just unionization efforts are really difficult. So there's an owner operators association. There's some other sort of quasi union organizations, but organized labor plays a really small role in determining conditions. So I don't see the same kind of promise there that we might begin to hope to see for warehouse workers, for example. Ian.
Awesome. Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. And this is really cool. And I'm very interested in the way that kind of AI and labor interface with each other in general. And so I was wondering in talking about the different ways that AI and automation gets kind of implemented, the like 3 different models that you gave. Mm-hmm. It seems like the handoff is kind of a kind of too ambitious a dream of like, oh, this robots will take over the menial parts of a kind of occupation or something like that. And that what's actually happening, the third option, hybridization, gives you kind of the inverse of that there's like no actual help for the drivers, like they don't benefit from this technology, but they're policed more heavily through it, and maybe punished like physically, which is terrifying. But I was wondering, so in those moments, in a few of the quotes that you had in the slides, there was this kind of recognition of like, I remember one was like, I don't need like a federal babysitter or something. Yeah. And this like recognition or like identification of what the surveillance and punishment mechanisms are attached to is like the federal government as opposed to like their labor conditions. So is there a kind of like ideological disconnect there that is being or could be addressed? And would something like that, would a shift in that kind of recognition make possible something closer to the second option, which I forget what the title was, but something that actually benefits in some structural way the conditions of drivers?
These are great.
So,
Those
yeah.
are a great question. Thank you very much for that. Yeah. So certainly. So first, as to this question of whether they see the intrusion as being federal, right, which was kind of as to this hours of service more regulatory mandate versus these other things that like the federal government is not, at least not now, although it's been proposed, looking at this type of fatigue data, right? There's been discussion actually of doing away with the hours of service regulations altogether. And instead of saying you can drive 11 hours, which is generally what it is, saying like you can drive until your physical indicators suggest that you're too tired. And we are not there yet. Like they've been asked to consider that and have said like, and we're not confident yet in that, we're not doing that yet, but it's come up, right? The other piece of it is that, drivers often, I don't want to say they get confused because that sounds like I'm denigrating them in some way, but like this technology is all sort of a piece, right? Like it's almost as though the government said like, you know what, everybody has to buy a phone that makes phone calls, but like you can't buy a phone that makes phone calls. You have to buy a phone that makes phone calls and also texts and also gets you onto the internet and also includes all these other things. And that's what this is, right? Like it's almost impossible to find a technology that does what's required by the regulators, but doesn't do these other things, right? Or doesn't do at least some of these other things. So in some sense, it's almost like, I call this in the book, like interoperable surveillance, right? The government surveillance is one piece of it, but the corporate surveillance, like really, they really are mutually constitutive, and they're like literally boxed together, right? They're bundled together. The other part of your question that I think is really important is this question about like, well, is there a good option here, right? Like, and I want to underscore, like, I think sometimes when we talk about like technology and labor, or automation and labor, there's this tendency to like valorize what came before, to say like, oh, yes, the craft of work, right? Wasn't it great when people just like did all this stuff with their hands or whatever? And like, what a shame that technology has infringed upon this, and like, I really resist that. Trucking is like a crappy job, right? Like, it is not, conditions are not good and have long been not good in trucking. I'm not suggesting like, what they should be able to do is just like work longer hours in the sweatshop. Like that is not the solution. I resist that. Instead, I think we should use this as sort of a touch point to say like, okay, the fact that we think we need these, why is it that we think we need these technologies? Well, the reason is because truckers are allowed to drive themselves to death and encouraged or sometimes required to drive themselves to death. We have tools in our wheelhouse to deal with that, but they are not technological tools. Truckers are exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act, so they don't get overtime pay. They don't get other worker protections that people get, to ensure their health and safety. If we just paid them for the time they drive, they wouldn't be like so motivated to like literally kill themselves. Like this isn't hard, right? But instead what we decide to do is not to change those incentive structures, but to police them, as you put it, right, for violating the law, which they are incentivized to break. So that to me is the way in which this technology may well, I think, be part of a set of reforms to the industry, but it has to be part of a set of reforms, right? It can't be like the only way in which we try to address the fatigue problem. We have to address it at the root, right? And not just kind of affect the folks with the least power in the way that we do so. I feel like I kind of like soapboxed that to you, and it wasn't an attack, or it wasn't intended to be an attack, but I just do think it's a really important, this is not like I'm against the technology. I'm just against using the technology as a solution. Anyway, Amir. Oh, hi, Amir. I think we emailed.
Hi, yes, we did. Thank you very much for the great presentations. I am actually like working on the first type of the designing shared control paradigms where human and automations are working with each other. And I realized that this transition of control between human and automation should be as smooth as possible. Otherwise, it causes confusion and people cannot work with each other. My question is, like, and I know that there are so many shared control paradigms that different peoples are working with each other, and they are using, they maybe they can use some of the technologies that you presented in the Robotrucker about maybe they can be used for transitioning the control between human and automation. But the main question is like, what are the main differences for transitioning the control between the automation and the truck driver versus the automation and the just normal driver that we have? every day. Like if someone like if we
Mm-hmm.
develop the technology for Tesla, can we just
Yeah.
like go ahead and apply it to the trucks?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I like the way you frame that. I think there's probably two things that I would focus on. One would be the fatigue concern in passenger car driving is just not, it's not anywhere close to the fatigue concern. And I mean, you know, if you're driving somewhere and you feel like you need a break, you can do it because like, who cares, right? Like that's fine. That's not the case in trucking, right? Obviously we're not driving 28 hours straight. So that just changes the paradigm really substantially.
Mhm.
We're also just not getting paid, right? So like the financial incentive doesn't exist, so that it just changes the incentives a lot. The other thing, and maybe this actually cuts in the opposite direction, you know, sometimes people say like, well, you know, it's too bad because, you know, these, and I actually agree with this to some extent. This is like in some sense like it's not a regulated industry, but truckers are doing their jobs on the public roads. I don't want to die on the public roads. You don't want to, nobody actually wants to die on the public roads. The truckers also don't want to die, right? Like it's fine for there to be some industries over which there's more control and more surveillance, you know, if that's what's required for public safety. And I agree with that, right? Like I think it's good that there are rules about how much they should be able to drive. It would make sense for us to enforce those rules if we think that they're legitimate. But that kind of brings me back, I think, to my response to Ian's question, which is that, you know, I'm actually fine with enforcing the law. I just want the law to be enforced in a way that is addressing the root of the problem and not like applying some band-aid of technology to it, you know, without addressing those problems. So I think those are some key distinctions.
That's true. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I believe like this fatigue is like a great problem for transitioning the control. That
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Bohan, I might be mispronouncing your name.
Close enough, Boyan. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm a computer scientist, but I will ask you a totally non-technological question. So trucking is not the only industry which is kind of seeing certain level of decline, right?
Yep.
Trucking because of automation, but we have coal and energy because of the environmental concerns and so on. And I think when you rationally look at it, the decline is almost inevitable. So, I mean, you are looking at fewer jobs or at least very different jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, you did not discuss or even mention that anyone may be talking about retraining of all these people who are truckers.
Yeah.
And that reminds me, I used to teach at West Virginia University, and you know, I have seen how this intentional avoidance of the issue of decline has taken place. And at some point, coal became this cult. And with the cult of coal, everything related to its decline became highly politicized, and you know the state changed from reliably blue to reliably red in the process because of the associated issues. My question really is, to what extent are these issues politicized? And number two, are we really, those of us in academia, too optimistic when we feel that people will rationally submit to training, retraining, and you know, changing their career path? Isn't it just, doesn't it appear from these large tectonic shifts that training is the last thing on anyone's mind?
Yeah, it's a great point, right? Yeah, so the retraining conversation obviously comes up when among folks who think autonomous trucks are impending. And a lot of that conversation, that at least in my own experience talking to folks in the industry, has been, first of all, a lot of folks in trucking say, if you think we're going to retrain these truckers, like you haven't met these truckers, which may or may not be the case. I don't know about that. It's been sort of common to talk about letting truckers sort of be the training data for autonomous vehicle technology, right? Like that we would, you know, monitor them and instrument them and then use that data. I'm not technically adept enough to know whether that's actually fruitful or not. But to your broader point, I agree, right? Like it's interesting to talk about something like retraining when we are like many states have just lowered the age for folks to get a commercial driver's license from 21 to 18 because we just don't have enough people to do this job in an acute way, in a way that means people don't get their insulin or their strawberries, right? Like if that's the case, it's very odd to be talking about retraining. Let me also note that you do not want to drive next to an 18-year-old who's behind the wheel of a 100,000-pound vehicle those are the least, it's ironic, right? Because the job has become so bad for retention, we end up hiring these kids who are like just emphatically the worst drivers, right? Like their accident rate is sky high compared to folks who've been driving for millions of miles. So our kind of, means of addressing this problem is really quite backwards and sort of self-defeating, right? Because we instead just like try to, Pete Buttigieg called this like filling a leaky bucket, right? He's the DOT secretary at the moment. And it was cool to hear him say that, because I don't think a previous administration has sort of acknowledged that instead of making a job suck less, the approach has previously been like, just get more people to do it for like 6 months before they either die or churn out, right? And there's another way to do it that has maybe, has a better profile, right? Will give us more longevity in the industry. I somehow lost my little picture of, oh, there it is. Nicholas.
I think I was behind.
Oh, sorry. I apologize. I'm sorry, Lisa. Sorry about that.
That's all right. I know changes the way your titles appear sometimes.
Yeah, I have too much going on the screen right now.
Thank you so much for that. I've been, like I said, I just happened to have seen some articles recently on the trucking industry and the churn. And but the one thing that I wanted to follow up on or ask you about, because I don't think that I missed it in your talk, is the, and I don't know the term of art, but the truck trains, where you would have a driver with an automated second truck behind
Yeah,
them.
a platoon.
It seems to maybe address part of the point, but more importantly, I think in terms of what we're looking for as consumers, assuming we stay on the same pace of consumption, you get twice as many pounds, right, per driver.
Yep.
But in a better world, that would increase the pay. Do you have any sense of where that stands and whether there's any chance that might improve the lot of truck drivers?
That is such a good question. No one has ever, I've given 100 talks about trucking and no one has ever asked me that question, but I love it. So that's called truck platooning. And I agree, actually, that is potentially the most promising use of autonomous vehicles. So the idea behind the platoon, right, is that, like, as you pointed out, the autonomous truck follows the human-led truck, but the following distance can be much shorter because you have vehicle-to-vehicle technology that's controlling that, right? Kind of like adaptive cruise control. And it's really, really good for aerodynamics. So it's good for fuel consumption because the trucks are essentially like one big truck at that point. I think that is the place. So when I talk to trucking companies about autonomy, many of them think that like full autonomy is maybe 40 years away. Like they are just not buying into the hype because of all the problems that we've talked about. But the place where they are investing is in platooning technology. The company that's biggest in that area is unfortunately called Peloton, but not the same Peloton as the one that makes all the bikes. So they need to rebrand. Yeah, they were around first, but I think they kind of got overtaken by the bikes. But I agree. And actually, one of the next projects I want to do is going to look at how we divide up profit. So sometimes you can have a platoon that's made up of more than one human driver as well as autonomous vehicles. And there are interesting questions there about kind of cost sharing, like who is it that like reaps the benefit of the efficiency? And that's kind of something I want to start looking at next. So I'm so glad you asked. Okay, Nicholas.
Thank you. And thank you for your talk. It was super interesting. I wanted to know if there have been any kind of, I'm thinking about like a project manager at one of these companies who's like trying to automate, trucking. And do they ever bring in truckers? And I'm assuming if they do or try to, there might be some resistance because of the like agency you talk about in trucking culture to like the involvement in this, creating like this new kind of, or new mode of doing trucking labor. I was wondering if you like encountered any kind of discussions about that in your time researching this.
Yeah, and when you say project managers at these companies, do you mean the technology companies that are building AVs, or that are?
Yeah, like maybe the trucking companies who are looking at, or the vehicle manufacturer companies who are making these vehicles, but also for like the surveillance and automation, like tracking systems as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. Do they work with truckers, or do they integrate truckers' views into it in some way? There are some, oftentimes the person that's going to be buying these is not the trucker necessarily, right? The trucker, or like an owner operator who like owns their own truck, is realizing almost no value from like fleet analytics because they're like, well, I know where I was. Or like if the fleet is me and my brother, which is like a large number of trucking companies, like you're just not realizing that much value from all this stuff. It's the big companies like the top 10, like Schneider, or like the ones that you see on the highway a lot, that are making a lot of these purchasing decisions. And so like what the trucker thinks, especially since the trucker's probably not going to be in that job for more than a few months, like is not super significant. That said, there are some companies that have sort of tried to pitch themselves as like trucker friendly. And they have super interesting marketing approaches. Actually, my very favorite one is a company that is now defunct, sadly, but it was called FELD, which you can imagine what the F stands for, and the rest of it is electronic logging device. And their marketing material, this is right after the mandate, right after truckers like had to start buying and installing these systems. And they were like, there's a big market segment of truckers who like do not like this, like do not want it. And our segment is going to be the reluctant ELD purchaser who like has to buy this thing. And so the way they distinguished themselves in part was that they made it specifically difficult for law enforcement to access their data. Like it was intentionally non-intuitive interface. Now I think there's a rule that it has to be like standard, like no, you can't get away with that anymore. But for a while, like that was their whole sales pitch, is like, let's like make it difficult for the feds. And their advertisement was this thing that said, there's something fishy about the ELD mandate, but I can't put my finger on it. And then it was a picture of like a hand like flipping off the viewer. It was just, I mean, it's like a little bit funny because it was like cheeky and stuff, but it also was interesting, right? Because it's kind of this form of like a funny form of resistance where they were officially like doing the monitor, right? They were a surveillance company in a sense, right? They were tracking the data, but they were doing the bare minimum that was required. They didn't have all these add-ons and cameras and, you know, shock wristbands and stuff. But they recognized that like the resistance component in the industry is strong, right? And that there was a market share there. So that's not exactly an answer to your question, but I wanted to tell the story.
That's exactly what I was looking for. Yeah, thank you. That's interesting.
Sure.
So there's been a question in the chat, which I'm going to try to condense, that there's other transport sectors which have had some automation. So at airplane autopilot and trains apparently are semi-autonomous. So how does this compare to that?
That's a great question. I don't know very much about trains at all, I'll admit. But for planes, so this comes up fairly often, right? Because planes also often have an autopilot, or, you know, always, I think, have an autopilot component. And there are questions about the way in which that maybe does that deprofessionalize airplane pilots in the same way it does truckers? There's a couple of key points of difference. One is that there are just many fewer airline pilots, and airline pilots are specifically subject to a lot of training, like annual training, that like keeps their skills from degrading, right? So some of the problems we might be worried about that I mentioned earlier, where like if a trucker just never drives, right? And then all of a sudden there's an emergency, that trucker is screwed in a way that an airline pilot isn't, both because the airline pilot has to keep their skills up for the license, and also because, and I hate to say this because I actually have a fear of flying, so it's like this is difficult for me to think about, but you actually have many more seconds to regain control over a plane than you do a vehicle, right? You have like multiple seconds to recover from a problem. Those are terrifying seconds, I'm sure, but at least they're there, right? So the handoff is not nearly as acute of a problem because the safety critical situation is just like not as compressed in time. So in that sense, there's some difference between kind of the prospects for one versus the other. Beyond that, I'm not sure. I haven't like done deep research about kind of the way in which pilots themselves have like responded as a professional organization to automation. I don't get the sense that there's the same sort of resistance to it or sense of de-skilling that there is in trucking, but I don't know. Oh, I didn't know this, Bojan, that that this accident had to do with these training limitations. So I should look into that in more depth.
Yeah, look into it. It's all over the internet, and it's a good report. This is the flight from Brazil to Paris that it fall because of the bad weather, and the bad weather is never the reason for a plane to fail and to fall.
Yeah.
And it was the experienced pilot was taking a rest for a couple of hours, and an inexperienced pilot was in charge and just couldn't handle the complexity of the navigation in bad weather, which experienced pilots do routinely.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are some implications in both.
That's interesting. Terrifying, but I will force myself to read about it anyway.
I mean, I suppose there's also just it's less frequently that there's something to run into if you're in an airplane. Right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, the number of deaths on the public roads is obviously like astronomically higher. The distances between things are much shorter. you know, it's not to say that, I mean, it is more, it's objectively more dangerous. And then it's just that the response times are so much lower. So plus, you know, to get your CDL, you need to go to a training school for 6 weeks, right? Like, and you could be 18. Like, it's just a very different set of professional standards, right, that they're subject to.
All right, so so Cody asked about unionization in the trucking industry. I think you had at the very beginning said something about that, but
yeah, I don't have too much more to add, except that I think that the prospects are low, for a variety of reasons. I mean, maybe the only other thing I could add that I didn't say earlier, which is that, you know, the rate is in the single digits and you don't see a lot of mobilization, is that, you know, there's been some thinking recently, especially after what happened in Canada, right, and subsequently a little bit in DC, about kind of coordinated political action among truckers. In the trucking community, like, or in the trade press, it's interesting, right? So like folks may know, right, that there was like some mobilization and this kind of like sit-in is not the word. I don't know what's the word for what they did when they congested all the roads for several weeks. There's a name for that that's escaping me. That was partly about vaccine mandates for when you cross the border. And in the trucking industry, there's actually been like a lot of hesitation about that. A lot of the folks who apparently were involved in planning that were not really truckers. They were like political operatives who kind of maybe used truckers as like the face of what was going on. And a lot of truckers there are certainly truckers who like are against the vaccine mandates for sure. But there's also kind of a thinking that, you know, if there's going to be massive mobilization, it shouldn't be about this, right? It should be about these other safety problems that are actually like quite essential to ensuring the livelihood of the folks working in the industry. So there was like some trepidation that people would kind of get the wrong idea about what real truckers cared about. So I think it's been a little bit counterproductive to kind of have this sudden visibility into political action for truckers. But
wouldn't the turnover in the industry also make unionization harder?
That's a great point. Yeah. If folks, and I mean, one thing that's a little bit that I sort of was willfully misleading about with the turnover rate, some of that is churn from one company to the next, right? So trucking it's not like, you know, you work at UNC and I work at Cornell, and like if I move to UNC, it would be like this, which I'm not suggesting, right? But like if we move our jobs, it's like we uproot our lives and our families. It's not the same in trucking, right? Like trucking for one firm is like not so different from trucking for another firm, because you're kind of just doing your own thing on the road all the time anyway. So it's easier to hop from firm to firm. And some of that churn is just that, is truckers moving from one job to the next. But also, that also doesn't help, right, for unionization, because your coworkers, to the extent you have any, are not folks that you know for a long period of time, and or you're just exiting the industry altogether. Yeah, Ian, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking, because the kind of I want to say blockade or slowdown or whatever it was,
What was it
the kind of
called?
trucker,
Yeah.
I forget.
Me
But
too.
that kind of movement as kind of bringing trucking as an occupation and as a kind of like social position into the public eye, also coincided with, I had to look at the trial of Aguilera Maderos in Colorado, the man who was charged or found guilty on 27 counts, including vehicular homicide and vehicular assault, for his trucks or his brakes failing because of you know, things. And that there was a blip of like kind of, at least in kind of labor organizing circles that I see in social media and stuff like that, there was a moment of like, oh, this is kind of a major moment for different and on the other side of the kind of political and organizational spectrum of like, oh, here's recognition of the ways that truckers are actually being kind of majorly harmed by the structures and legality of the things that they do. So I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that the account was that his brakes failed, he crashed into cars, and then he was guilty of the charges because he was the owner of the vehicle, even though it was kind of the structures of kind of the demands placed on him and the low pay that he received, that he wasn't able to or wasn't aware of the problems with that particular truck. And so that it was just that kind of where the responsibility lies, and especially kind of that he was not compensated or kind of structurally protected from the things that were brought on him by the structure of his employment, I guess. I don't know if I'm phrasing that right, but that it seemed like a different kind of moment of political recognition that kind of ran very opposite to the Canadian kind of protests, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I have to admit, I'm not familiar with that case. It rings a bell, but I don't know the details about it. But more generally, like some of what you just acknowledged about ownership, there's a really, really good book called The Big Rig, get it, by Steve Viselli, who's like there's like two of us who do this stuff, and we try to like never be in the same place at the same time so that one of us will always survive like some attack or something. But he's the other trucking sociologist. And this book, The Big Rig, which is really excellent, is about ways in which kind of the notion of owning your own truck, like truckers are subject to all these like predatory lease agreements or like rent to own agreements where, you know, the financial terms are awful and they end up making no money, or they end up paying, like owing money to their employers after the work week because of the payments they have to make on these trucks. They're just incredibly incredibly non-transparent. There's a bunch of lawsuits going on about them. But he talks about that and about some of the other notion of, you know, like labor misclassification, which is not, you know, obviously that's a feature of a lot of different labor sectors, not just trucking, but that also happens in trucking, where things like, you know, legal responsibility and maintenance requirements and things like that attach to the trucker because the trucker is the one who officially might own the truck. But like none of the other features of ownership, right? Like there's no autonomy in deciding, you know, who you're going to truck for or something, right? They're often exclusive agreements that you have with Walmart or with whoever. So they put truckers in like in between a rock and a hard place in the way that you're acknowledging, where they absorb risk and cost, but they don't get the benefits that might come with ownership.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else got a question? We got a couple minutes if we need it.
I have one quick question. So this might be out of the purview, but I was wondering how much are these organizations who are putting in this technology working with, I guess, not the truck drivers themselves, but the general public? Because I mean, you can read almost any article and there's, I think, negative views about for truckers. So is there a way to like use the general public to like enforce changes that would be positive for all groups? And is that happening at the moment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the general public, I mean, so there's the feature of it that we already talked about a little bit, right? Which is the degree to which we all kind of participate in the system that places these untenable demands on truckers. But even more directly, I would say the general public, oftentimes like there's a lot of NIMBYism around trucking. So the other part of it that I haven't talked about today so much is that there's infrastructure required to let truckers get the rest they need. And that's largely like truck parking, like allowing truckers to go through your town and to park somewhere safely. And like literally nobody wants a truck stop. Like so many communities are like, no trucks on our roads. And like, we're not gonna allow that kind of parking. For a long time, Walmart has opened up its, and I think they're maybe stopping this though, has opened up its parking lots at night for truckers to stop and like stock up. And they've sort of, Walmart has like oddly become almost this like de facto network of truck stops. And I think they've kind of stopped doing it because people are so negative about truckers that they just like think that, you know, crime and like illicit sexual activity and all kinds of drug use and stuff like that will attend truckers stopping. So what we get, right, is like we sort of like, it's the self-fulfilling prophecy. Like if we don't build the infrastructure for people to get the rest that they need, right, to like recharge and be safe, then they can't do that, right? And like they end up doing things like you'll sometimes see a truck parked like just off of the side of an exit, which they're not allowed to do and which is very dangerous, right? But like we don't want to see it, right? We want to get the benefits of it, but we don't want to provide anything in return. So the short of that's a long answer. That's a long way of saying I don't think the public is like clamoring to really help. Like occasionally there's some article in the Times or something about like how much it stinks to be a trucker these days and isn't that too bad? Which is nice. Like I'm glad we're paying attention. The Biden administration is like finally maybe making some policy moves to start to acknowledge these things in a very slow way, but more than we've seen before. John Oliver did a segment on trucking last week, which was great actually, and which like acknowledged a lot of these problems. But I think we've got a long way to go before the public like rallies behind this group of workers that we really need.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So I think we've held Karen for longer than the legal limit that she had to monitor this.
It's true.
Too long. So why doesn't everyone join me in thanking her for the time and the talk?
Thank you for having me.
And we do have, the center does have another talk coming up with Dr. Seya Abimbola, I may be mispronouncing that, but it's about research funding and parachute research into developing countries by the medical community. So that will be on the 21st of April with PR materials forthcoming. Until then, thanks everybody.
Bye, thank you.